Hey now, everybody. Welcome to Inglit.org. This is Professor Island, and today we are talking about some aspects of horror literature, and specifically, it is the man or woman versus society trope, especially within the horror genre. Keep in mind that the notion of an individual against society is certainly one of the original aspects of the horror genre, especially since the idea of the Gothic was about an individual often at sea in this world that they found full of sorrow. But also some of the original stories, including the Castle of Otranto and the Monk and others, are about an individual who is either trying to figure out what's going on within a society or finds himself somehow outcast in a society. And these things are pretty standard through literature. And sometimes we like the outcast and sometimes we don't. When we're looking at a story such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we have two things going on here. We have Victor himself, who is going against society, and certainly a religious society, by essentially wanting to play God. But we also have the creature itself, which is also going against society because they are frightened by it. And a lot of the story really delves around these issues for both of these characters as this epistolary approach of, we get letters and remnants and things like that that tell the story. And then essentially what we realize is that on both sides there is this notion that the individual is struggling against society either to be accepted or to be respected or even just to simply be loved. Later on we have another female writer who focused specifically on issues of a woman in society, and that would be, of course, Charlotte Perkins Gilman and her story of the yellow, called the yellow wallpaper, in which she is examining a woman's place in a male-dominated society. And certainly her work and works of Kate Chopin and the like, while not necessarily defined as horror, although this particular story was considered a ghost story, so it fits within our genre, is this idea of this individual who's struggling against society's norms at a time when society reading this would automatically assume that the person struggling against the norms is in the wrong. Certainly the way that Chopin, but specifically in this case, Gilman was accepted and reread in the 1960s during the second wave feminist movement, and certainly by this new wave of students who eventually created feminist theory. It changed the way the work was translated. It changed the way the work was accepted, and it changed its place in American and other English language literature. Certainly, Franz Kafka, when his works were translated into English, tapped into the notion of the real socio-political world that had to do more with politics rather than gender politics, and his work. His works often included a protagonist who, whether it's Gregor Samsa in Metamorphosis, or it's a story like The Trial or something along those lines, in which you have an individual who essentially is at odds against the society, and either with the Metamorphosis successfully transforms and becomes an iconic figure that forces everybody else to become better, or in the case of The Trial, you have essentially a person who is battling against a political and social force that offers no information, no support, no clarity, and really this is just a metaphor for certainly for Stalinistic Soviet bloc worlds, but also could be applied to any environment in which you have a very powerful government that is forcing things on an individual with very little information. And certainly the Nazis would fit in that, and you just kind of go around the world and you can find that instance of that. Certainly when we get to more modern, more contemporary, really, American literature, Shirley Jackson, who herself was an iconic figure. She was a non-Jewish woman who married a Jewish person, and she lived in a very small town in which her husband would have stood out as iconic. And of course, she herself was iconic, being a professional writer who smoked a pipe and wandered around talking to herself. These things all impacted how she wrote and how she saw the world. And certainly when you look at The Lottery and her portrayal of this woman in a complicated way, sometimes we don't know whether to be on Tessie Hutchinson's side or not, but it's clear she has a conflict with society, and she has a conflict with society prior to being chosen for the lottery. And then we have to ask ourselves whether or not this mechanism was a way to get rid of undesirables. And certainly in 1940s America, this conversation about whether or not society is intentionally, as a group, is intentionally getting rid of its undesirables would have been a discussion of politics. It would have been a discussion of race and ethnicity and religion and the like. Movies also obviously have these same kind of tropes, and whether you have a story like The Fly, in which you have this individual who becomes a social pariah because of what he's turning into, or you have other stories in which somebody is standing up for themselves in a particular way. Again, this theme of the individual against the group, and how the author decides either we like this person or we don't like this person. We want to root for them or we don't. And whether it's, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the movies, the Frankenstein movies, or even Dracula, we have the story of an individual who goes against society's norms, and then we have to decide which one we like. Sometimes that trope changes. Certainly within the Dracula and the whole vampire thing, the vampire started off as a purely evil creature, and evil was defined as night living and consumed with sex and consumed with pleasure. And of course now the vampire figure has been turned into more of a romantic figure, although there were certainly hints of that in some of the early versions of that. Once we get into the author being more of in this case of Hitchcock, being a voyeur of sorts, who takes the perspective of an individual and shows how they see society. What he did in several of his movies, including The Birds and certainly in Psycho, is he has a character who has broken the law, both literally but also morally. In many cases, his woman character, his main female character, is an attractive young woman who is not married, who is engaged in a sexual relationship with another man, sometimes a married man, but certainly within the context of a traditional and conservative society, that alone would be enough, that she's engaging in this without marriage. But also she breaks the law. She steals something, she gets money, and of course, we could use this as a metaphor for a woman gaining independence and the way that she gets knocked back down again, in the same way that we saw Tessie Hutchinson stand up for herself, and then even her own family turns against her. But we then, we see this individual against society in other stories as well that are not based perhaps on gender, but based on other things. And certainly the Night of the Living Dead, of course, the whole zombie thing has gone crazy, and everybody loves their zombies. But the original Night of the Living Dead was Romero really discussing race relations, because the main character in this story is an African-American fellow who is the only person, apparently, who has lived a life that has prepared him for dealing with unrelenting and illogical violence and threat. And everybody else is completely at sea. They have no idea how to deal with this. He's the only one who does, and he spends most of his time battling the insecurities and suspicions of the very people that he's trying to save. And of course, when the movie ends and he is basically dispatched by the rescuers simply because they think he's the bad guy, Romero is really hitting us over the head with this expression that this man, who is the strongest, most intelligent, most able and capable person in the movie, is essentially always going to be at odds with society essentially in a racist environment. We also saw this actually turned around in a different way when it came to gender relations in the 1970s. Duel is a story that was written by Richard Matheson, based actually on a real experience that he had driving out to the desert. But when it was made into a movie by a young Steven Spielberg, the story really was about this fellow, this guy named Mann, actually, who is battling a very rapidly changing world in which he is both being threatened by very masculine versions of men who want to belittle him and have mastery over him, but also very strong women who are exerting mastery over him. And he needs to find a way to essentially, in the case of this 1970s movie, is to find his inner man and somehow decide whether he's going to be crushed by, literally crushed by the things that threaten him, both male and female, or if he's going to change and have to stand up in some way, re-exert himself against a society that seems bent on destroying him. In Jaws, we have a little bit of different trope, and what we have is we have a small town versus the interloper, and in this case, the small town is Amity, in which you have this individual who comes into Amity, and he's an outsider. And Amity is a town in New England that lives on tourism. And the outsider immediately recognizes that there is a threat in the form of a very large shark that would shut down this tourist trade. And the sheriff battles back and forth, both with his family and with the people who basically hired him, with the town itself, and of course with the shark, and even with individuals who would try to help him. There's always conflict, and he is, and of course, then you throw him out onto a boat, and he's afraid of the water. You throw him out onto a boat with two other people who are very comfortable with boats. One of them being an oceanographer, and the other one being a sea captain. And you have this thing where this guy is constantly the only guy who is not apparently in on things. And the story of this presentation of Roy Scheider's character within this context is really about how many ways this guy is an outsider and battling society's views and society's mores. And then finally you get something like King Kong, and you're saying, how does this fit? Well, King Kong, what we do is we take an animal, a human-like animal of sorts, and we put them into the same situation. And anytime you have a story in which an individual comes into an environment in which they're unfamiliar and everybody else seems to want to kill them, you essentially have the same story. And so we could, especially if we look at King Kong as an empathetic figure, and if the movie has presented Kong as a heroic and empathetic figure, we begin to realize that the author's really examining what it's like to be the outsider, to be put upon by others, and what it takes to fight back in order to survive. The man versus society, which is the traditional way, but man or woman versus society trope is pretty standard in horror, because very often it really is that individual who must battle against these horrific elements in order to survive. And certainly, as you see this is something you're going to want to examine, not only for the obvious aspects of it, but also perhaps for the psychological aspects of it, the mythological constructs and archetypes that are used within that, and of course what the author's saying through your Marxist analysis, what the author's saying by creating this particular story with these particular characters and this particular plot line. If you have any questions, you can always go on to Inglet.org and look around and find some more elements in the discussions of literary terms. But also, if you can always send me an email at ingletguy@earthlink.net, and stay in touch.